They say the story of African slavery is the story of the Americas. Ships crossing the Atlantic, plantations in the South, millions stolen from their homeland. But their children and grandchildren survived to tell the story. But there's another slave trade that lasted 3 times longer, took just as many people, and left almost no descendants to remember them. For over 1,000 years, Arab traders moved millions of African women across deserts and oceans. These women had children. They built families. They survived the journey. So where are their descendants today? The answer will shake you to your core. Because this wasn't just slavery. This was erasure. Today, we're diving deep into the trade that made Black women and their bloodlines disappear. Picture Zanzibar in 1860. The sun beats down on stone buildings as hundreds of African women stand chained in the slave market. European explorer David Livingstone walks through, documenting what he sees. Women sold for housework. Women sold as concubines. Women who will bear children in foreign lands. He writes in his journal that 2/3 of the people being sold are women and girls. 2/3. This wasn't unusual. For over a millennium, from the year 650 to the 1960s, Arab and Islamic traders deliberately targeted African women. They moved them across 3 massive routes. Caravans trudged across the Sahara Desert toward North Africa. Ships sailed up the Red Sea toward Arabia. More ships crossed the Indian Ocean toward Persia and beyond. The numbers are staggering. Historians estimate between 10 and 18 million Africans were taken through these routes. That's almost as many as the entire Atlantic slave trade. But here's what will blow your mind. In the Americas, 12 million enslaved Africans became 40 million descendants by 1860. In the Arab world, 15 million enslaved Africans became almost nothing. If you want more hidden stories like this that they kept out of your history books, hit that subscribe button for Black Stories Untold. Now, back to how an entire people vanished. The journey itself was designed to kill. Imagine being chained to 20 other women, walking across the Sahara for 2 months. No shade, barely any water. When someone collapses, the caravan keeps moving. Contemporary accounts say 30 to 50% died before reaching the markets, sometimes more. The weak were left for the vultures. But the women who survived faced something even more devastating than death. They faced a system designed to erase their children from history. Here's how it worked. When an enslaved African woman was bought in Cairo or Baghdad or Yemen, she wasn't just a worker. She was absorbed into a household where everything about her was systematically destroyed. Her name was changed to something Arabic. She was forced to convert to Islam. She was taught to speak only Arabic or Persian or Turkish. Within months, Amina from Mali became Fatima, the house servant. Kessie from Tanzania became Zara, the concubine. The women themselves survived, but their identities were murdered. Then came the children. Under Islamic law, if an enslaved woman had a child with her free master, that child was born free. Sounds good, right? It was actually the cruelest part of the system. That free child couldn't inherit slavery from their mother. They were legally Arab or Persian or Turkish. They grew up speaking the father's language, following the father's religion, carrying the father's name. The African mother was erased from the family tree. Her son might become a merchant or a scholar. Her daughter might marry into an important family, but neither would identify as African. The bloodline continued, but the heritage died. Generation by generation, African DNA was absorbed into these societies like drops of water in an ocean. This wasn't an accident. This was a machine built to eliminate African identity while keeping African bodies. But here's where it gets even more sinister. The system made sure most African men couldn't father any children at all. Male slaves were castrated in horrific operations that killed 60 to 90% of them. The ones who survived became eunuchs who served in palaces and harems. They could never start families. They could never pass on their names or stories. Meanwhile, the women were kept fertile and productive, but their children legally belonged to other men. So African women carried African blood into the next generation, but that blood flowed through veins that claimed different ancestors. The women became grandmothers to Arabs, Persians, and Turks who had no idea where half their DNA came from. The math is devastating. In Jamaica, 600,000 enslaved Africans brought through the Atlantic trade became 2.7 million descendants today. In Egypt, millions of enslaved Africans brought through the Sahara left maybe a few thousand people who identify as having African heritage. That's not because fewer people were taken. It's because the children were legally stolen from their mothers and claimed by their fathers' cultures. An enslaved woman named Asha might have 10 grandchildren living in Morocco, but those grandchildren call themselves Moroccan. They speak Arabic. They know nothing about Asha's homeland. Her genes live on, but her story died with her. This system works so well that entire populations vanished from memory. Look at Iraq, where African slaves built massive sugar plantations in the 9th century. They even revolted in 869 CE. Thousands of enslaved Africans fought a 14-year war against their oppressors. They won battles, they captured cities, then they were crushed. Today, most Iraqis have no idea this history even happened. The rebels' descendants, if they survived, were absorbed and renamed until Africa became a forgotten detail in their bloodlines. Keep watching, because what comes next will show you exactly how thorough this erasure really was. The legal framework made resistance almost impossible. A woman could be freed if she bore her master's child, but only after he died. Until then, she remained property. Her children were free, but they owed everything to their father. Why would they honor their enslaved mother's heritage when that heritage brought only shame in their society? Why would they teach their own children about grandma's village in Sudan when they could talk about grandpa's house in Damascus instead? The system created powerful incentives to forget, and generation after generation, people chose to forget. Even the women's names disappeared from official records. They weren't listed as mothers in family trees. They weren't buried with proper headstones. They weren't mentioned in their children's marriage documents. Islamic law said their children were legitimate, but it didn't say the mothers mattered. A wealthy merchant's son could become famous, but historians wouldn't bother recording that his mother was an enslaved woman from Ethiopia. She was just a detail, an invisible source of life for a family that claimed completely different roots. Consider the case of Tipu Tip, one of the most powerful slave traders in East Africa during the 1800s. His own ancestry mixed African and Arab bloodlines, but he identified as Arab and grew wealthy selling other Africans. His story shows how quickly African identity could be discarded when it became profitable to claim something else. The children and grandchildren of enslaved women learned this lesson early. Being African meant being property. Being Arab meant being free. The choice was obvious, and it was heartbreaking. The women understood what was happening. Some tried to keep pieces of their culture alive. They sang songs from home while working. They cooked familiar foods when they could find the ingredients. They whispered stories to their children about the villages they came from. But these efforts faced impossible odds. The children learned Arabic in the streets, Quran verses in school, and their father's family history at dinner. Mom's lullabies in Swahili couldn't compete with an entire society telling them they were something else. By the second generation, the songs were forgotten. By the third generation, even the memory of the songs was gone. This is why walking through Cairo or Baghdad or Riyadh today, you won't find neighborhoods that call themselves African. You won't find cultural centers celebrating Malian heritage or Kenyan traditions. You won't find families with surnames that trace back to the savannah or the highlands. The people are there. The DNA is there. But the identity was surgically removed. Millions of Arabs, Persians, and Turks carry African genes without knowing it. Their ancestors included brave women who survived impossible journeys. But that bravery exists in bloodlines that claim completely different heroes. Compare this to what happened in Brazil, where enslaved Africans created candomblé religion, samba music, and capoeira martial arts. Their children stayed enslaved, which was horrible, but they also stayed together. They married each other. They built communities. They passed down languages, spiritual practices, and stories. Oppression couldn't stop them from creating a culture that survived centuries. Their descendants today can trace their roots to specific African ethnic groups. They kept the connections alive through music, food, religion, and family names. The Arab slave trade made sure none of that could happen. But that's not even the craziest part. The system was so effective that it erased itself from history too. Most people today have never heard of the Arab slave trade, even though it lasted longer and covered more territory than the Atlantic trade. There are no major Hollywood movies about it, no famous novels, no museum exhibitions touring the world. The descendants who might demand recognition and reparations simply don't exist in large enough numbers, or don't know their own history well enough to organize around it. The erasure was so complete that it erased the memory of the erasure itself. The women who built the foundations of families across North Africa, the Middle East, and beyond became ghost ancestors. Their great-great-grandchildren walked through Damascus and Marrakesh and Tehran with no idea that an African woman's strength runs through their veins. They don't know about the woman who crossed the Sahara in chains, learned a new language to survive, bore children in a foreign land, and watched those children grow up claiming a different heritage. Her DNA shaped their faces, but her story died with her. This is what makes the Arab slave trade different from every other system of human bondage in history. It didn't just steal people's freedom, it stole their future. It didn't just break up families, it broke the chain of memory that connects children to their ancestors. Atlantic slavery was brutal and dehumanizing, but it created the foundation for African American culture, Caribbean culture, and Afro-Brazilian culture. Millions of people today know they descend from enslaved Africans and carry that knowledge with pride. The Arab trade created nothing like that. It created silence. And the silence continues today. In many Middle Eastern and North African countries, talking about historical slavery makes people uncomfortable. They prefer to remember the legal protections Islam provided for enslaved people, not the millions who died or disappeared. They talk about how Islamic law encouraged freeing slaves, not about how the system kept capturing more. The countries that benefited from over 1,000 years of African labor have never had a serious reckoning with that history. There's been no truth and reconciliation process, no reparations programs, no national museums dedicated to African contributions. The erasure continues. Here's what this story reveals about power and memory. The most effective oppression doesn't just control people's bodies, it controls their descendants' minds. It makes the victims' own grandchildren forget they were ever victims. It turns genocide into voluntary assimilation. It transforms theft into gratitude. The Arab slave trade perfected this technique centuries before anyone else figured it out. They learned that you don't have to kill every member of a group to destroy them. You just have to make their children want to be something else. This is why you never learned about this in school. The Atlantic slave trade left millions of descendants who could demand that their ancestors' stories be told. They built institutions, wrote books, and fought for recognition. The Arab slave trade left scattered individuals who didn't even know they had a story to tell. When the victims' voices are silenced and their children's voices are redirected, the oppressor's version of history becomes the only version anyone hears. Every time you see a map showing the slave routes to the Americas, remember the routes that crossed the Sahara, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean. Every time you hear about the 12 million Africans taken to the New World, remember the 15 million taken to the Old World. And every time you think about the power of resistance and survival, remember that sometimes the cruelest victory isn't killing your enemies. It's making their children forget they were ever your enemies at all. The women who survived those desert crossings were warriors. Their strength lives on in bloodlines across 3 continents. But the system that enslaved them was so thorough that their own descendants don't know their names. If you want to see more stories about how power shapes memory and how the forgotten heroes of Black history still impact our world today, click the video on your screen now. These women's stories matter, even if their own great-grandchildren never learned to tell them.